So I'm here with my friend John Sweetland.
I'm here with my friend Rob Sharp.
Thank you.
That's right.
It's the first time he's ever called me a friend.
That's not true.
Well, so I wanted to get your perspective on competition, um, which sports is kind of the low-hanging fruit because you can see what shows up there very obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So even from children's sports to professional sports, there seems to be a value system that develops. For instance, if you live in an area where there's, high school football is
Mm-hmm.
the big thing, then being the towel boy is not as good as being a successful linebacker, which is not as good in a sense as being the star quarterback.
Right.
So,
But being the water boy in a place where football is valued is better than being the water boy for the football team where football isn't valued.
True. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So there's a negative side when you look at somebody like LeBron James, who almost in a sense gets worshipped by people for bouncing a ball. It's not like he split an atom or came up with clean energy or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there's as a Christian person, it's kind of easy to look at that and say I think there's something problematic about some of what happens in sports and the competitiveness too.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that there's got to be positives to competitiveness, team, character building, all those kind of things. But then competitiveness can also have its negative side where you're dancing on somebody else's head. I beat you and I'm better. I'm somehow more valuable now as a person. So what I've been wrestling with, and I don't have any real solid answers besides the two obvious bumpers on each side of that. It builds character. It's good in a lot of ways, team. But then on the other side, there's those negatives. So navigating down the middle of that. And the reason I wanted to talk to you about it particularly because over the 19, 20 years that we've been friends, we've shared a lot about our background in sports, which yours is way more. I like sports ball games. I played hockey and football, and I was never, tremendous at anything. I know you played football and were very into it, and even struggled maybe with some of the things that I'm talking about, the aggression and the I've got to beat this person or whatever. But so you've had a lot of experience in that, and I know, through the years, you have not been a particular fan of soccer, which they try to call football and infringe upon.
Well, if there's ever a sport that deserves to be called football, soccer is it.
Right.
But, not a big fan. You did play it.
Thinking about Nate Bargatze, talking about we're gonna have. I think he was on Saturday Night Live. And he was like, "Yeah, we're gonna have football," and the other men are asking, "Well, what's that?" It's a game where you throw a ball. You don't kick it. I'm confused. Well, you kick it sometimes. But so, but I thought it was very interesting some years back. I can't remember, probably 7 or 8, maybe longer years ago. There you stepped in for a youth league soccer team because their coach wasn't able to coach that season or whatever, and you took a team that was doing okay, and you brought them to a championship. And that I always thought that was very interesting.
You mentioned the idea of competition. Competition, whether competition can be good or bad, and whether there are positives or negatives. I think if you think of competition as a stage, and that what plays on the stage is the unfolding of character, right? You mentioned as we were talking about that idea of the uber competitive athlete who defeats his opponent and then does the little celebration in the guy's face, brags that he's now worth more in the eyes of people who watch it than the guy that he
Greatest guy in the world?
Right.
Never heard of him.
Right,
Greatest
exactly.
guy in the world.
Exactly. Yeah, 100-meter dash, just that quick, right? Fastest man in the world, 100th of a second. Never heard of the guy. And yeah, so, but the competition is the stage on which character is displayed. I find it fascinating if you go back in our nation's history and read the accounts that sports writers made back in the 20s, 1920s, 100 years ago.
Can I pause you for half
Sure.
a second there? Okay, I wasn't finished with your accolades, and this is what people that are watching this, I want them to understand that you're not just some sports fan. I would say that you could go on any ESPN sports show and hold your own with stats and history and predictions about different teams and management and everything else, which is I've always found very impressive.
Right.
Even the betting in Vegas.
I don't. Yeah.
But I think one of your most notable accomplishments in sports has been what you did with the homeschool track and field teams that you coached for many, many years with not asking for any compensation, just the opportunity to form some character and some understanding of life and God's plan for
I approached sport when I was young as a thing that was challenging me to improve and to excel. And I think I enjoyed it for that. But the older I got, the more I understood that what sports was doing was it was putting on display my own character. It was the art of competition is the unveiling of who I am, who I'm becoming, and I recognize that with my own experience playing sports. But at about age 19, almost 20, I gave my life to Jesus, and I became a Christian. And for a couple of years after that, I struggled at knowing what that meant. And I finally settled on the idea that as a believer, we are called to glorify God in all that we do. Okay, well, how do you do that in the mundanities that we're engaged in day to day? How do you do that in your family? How do you do that on the job? How do you do that when you're a student at school? How do you do that in your friendships, your relationships with others? How do you do that in sports? I read a book which is anonymously authored by the Rod and Staff Ministries, kind of an ultra conservative, ultra fundamental branch of Christianity. It expresses
alt right.
Well, I don't think. I think
I'm kidding.
highly unpolitical.
Yeah.
And sort of there's a grace there that they're simply trying to manifest the word, God's word, into aspects of life.
So boots on the ground application.
Absolutely. They came up with a book titled "The Question of Sports," and I picked it up. Had to. I knew that they were not favorably inclined towards competition for a variety of reasons. One, I think that it, in their view, it extols the virtue of winning, right? Sometimes winning at all costs. It extols the virtue of what it means to defeat your opponent, and it personalizes ideas like retribution and revenge. And it personalizes the idea.
Michigan State, Ohio State.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, rivalries and some of the vitriol that you see exhibited at sporting events on part of fans, much less the competitors. But people get competitive, even just engaging in watching sports.
Oh gosh, parents at their youth league.
Yeah, go to any little league baseball game, and you'll see exactly what's meant. Now, there's an added factor there in that they have little children of their own that are out there and they don't want to see anything awful or unfair happen to them.
Right.
And so they conclude that that justifies their response to certain things, which
Jumping the fence, rushing the.
oh my gosh, yeah. And so sports appeals on a level to these things just by its very nature. But its nature is what you brought up, which is the idea of competition.
Mhm.
But sports aren't the only place where we see competition.
Yeah, and this is kind of where this goes. Sports is easy to look at, but I mean, even competition in marriage, that I have to be right, I have to win this argument. Competition in business, I need to, put that guy out of business and corner a market or whatever.
Competition to church pastors. I got to have
Ooh.
a bigger congregation than the other guy, because that means obviously that I'm doing something right or better.
Mhm.
And then there's the competition for resources, right? And that, you were talking to a material naturalist, they would say that competition for resources is what all of our modern day competition is really all about.
Yeah, evolution has brought that about, right? Yeah.
Right. So why did the Father create man with capacity to compete? Was that something that God gave us? The question of sports, written again by this anonymous author with Rod and Staff Ministry, brought that question really to the front. So it was a decidedly negative book on the idea of sports. What was interesting though, as I finished the book, it was a pretty healthy read. It was probably about 175 pages long, and but one of the general takeaways that I had from it was that you could, in that book, replace the word sports with the word business, and you'd have the same book.
Academics, whatever, right?
So we engage in that. Take, for instance, Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. He wanted to know what it was that was meaningful under the sun when he considered his own life. And he engaged in the pursuit of understanding mirth and folly and madness and labor, even his own labor. He, in the first and second chapters there, he sort of prides himself on the idea that Solomon, had acquired more than anybody else ever had. And but the bane of his experiment, his study into what is meaningful in life, concluded with this controversy that says, but what about the wise man who's able to acquire all these things, to build that up? Who's he give that stuff to when he dies? Because he dies just like the fool. Both suffer the same event in life.
Yeah.
Competition, as you were, I think, rightly describing it, was this idea that we defeat our opponents, the stock and our value, it rises when we do that. Sell more T-shirts, we can get more fans in the stands, people are more interested in us, we become famous.
Yeah.
We achieve some sort of notoriety. And Solomon was indicating that that was what he was doing. But in the end, what does it mean? What does any of it mean if all that exists in life is what we see here under the sun? Well, then what is all this competing for resources, this competition that we see engaged in sports? What does any of it mean? What does any of it matter? And it's quite a depressing book, Ecclesiastes, if you're leaving it that all.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah,
it's so raw and honest about, yeah.
It is, that if you take things to their logical end, why, you'll end up in this place where, if this is what you've striven for, you're going to find it to be empty.
Yeah.
It's havel, mist, vapor, something you can see, but you can't grab, you can't latch on. Competition encompasses that idea in spades. It just does. You talk to any athlete who has ever set his or her sights on a particular goal. whether it was winning a championship or achieving a certain time in a distance event or running event. They get that, and then it's gone.
Yeah.
I've achieved the goal. What was supposed to happen? It wasn't transformative in my life. It didn't add anything. But along the way, it displayed our character. So I think one of the positive aspects of competition is that if we're at all introspective and reviewing what we do in business or on an athletic field, we can take note of our character as we've displayed it, and we can amend. We can say, "Oh, well, why bother with that? Why bother amending my character if what I've done has made me successful?"
Mm.
It's kind of like the might makes right idea,
Right.
and so rather than amending our nature, our character, it tends to solidify, to cement it, and this way of being has garnered me all this success, helped me to achieve a certain notoriety. So why change anything? Might makes right. But we as believers in Christ don't think that way. We don't think that might makes right. We know that right is a different commodity.
The greatest among you will be servant of all.
Yeah, that's right. There is that. I think that the idea that people will willingly submit themselves to like a winning team or a winning organization, simply to be able to ride on the coattails of success, is another interesting phenomenon of sports. Sports and competition in general tend to influence. When you go onto social media and you read these influencers, you're not reading influencers who are Joe Schmo who works at the checkout line at the local Kroger grocery store. He's not an influencer.
Yeah.
She's not an influencer. You're looking for people, and we begin to worship at that.
Yeah.
Literally worship, or set up as idols and say, well, I want this person to influence me. Influence you to do what? Solomon said, influence you to achieve all this material wealth.
I know Solomon was supposed to be the wisest man who ever lived, but
he married 700 wives.
Yeah, 700 wives, 300 concubines. Can you imagine all the mother-in-laws?
Well,
is that wise?
I was going to say, my hands are more than satisfied in working with one woman. I don't.
Some of the really beautiful moments that I've seen in sports, something else gets represented when I can't remember which race it was or whatever, but there was a distance race, and this has happened in more than one sport, but the one that I remember, it was very interesting that one of the runners behind the leader fell, and this guy turns around and goes back and helps this other runner up. This is your competition, but there's like mercy and grace.
The reality there, Rob, is that 100, 150 years ago, that was not rare in sports to see that happen. There was an expressed interest in dignity, not only your own dignity, but the dignity of others who competed. I think, 100, 150 years ago, there weren't the economic incentives that were attached to sports. There were obviously in business, those things. But because there wasn't the money involved, people understood sports competition as a game.
Fair play, yeah.
Well, right. And again, I think they had a better grasp on it, knitting together their character and displaying their character than they did trying to achieve some sort of notoriety through it.
Yeah.
But now business, that's different. Competition in business is all about money.
Yeah.
And so business was never looked at as a game. So you don't see many stories where the two companies that compete in an industry, one is having some success, the other one's struggling to achieve success. You don't usually see stories in business where the competitor who's having success turns around and helps the guy who's struggling in his industry to have
Well,
success.
let me highlight something that, again, was very impressive to me about the way that you deal with people. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to get together today to talk about that. But in your business, you've been very successful just because of the way that you treat customers and the way that you treat the people that work with you. And I still remember there was a competing company that directly competes with your business, and they were having trouble with their trucks, and they couldn't afford to have their trucks repaired.
Oh,
And I heard through the grapevine and through the repair shop that you actually paid to have their trucks fixed so they could keep working, and that was kind of like helping that runner that was falling. That was very interesting.
When I was young, we used to walk to school, my brother and I, in Chicago in the winter, and Mom would make our lunch in the morning. We'd take it with us in these brown paper bags.
Did it look like a Christmas Story? Were you guys all bundled up in the?
Although nobody got their tongue stuck on it, if I can recall. Right?
Good.
So we were careful not to step on cracks to break our mother's back.
Oh, absolutely.
One day, my brother Chris and I were walking, and we were about 3/4 of the way to the schoolhouse, and Chris looked down and he had his paper bag in his hand, but the salt and the snow that was on the ground had gotten the bottom of that bag wet, and his lunch had fallen out somewhere along the way.
Oh, no.
He's my younger brother, and I don't know that we had particular sibling rivalry, but we weren't always. But I couldn't stand to think that he would go to school
Hungry
without something to eat. So I gave him my bag.
Oh.
Now, I say that not to say, "Oh, what a great guy," because I was an awful human being. In many ways, I still am.
Charged interest and.
Well, no, Matt. Yeah, no, I don't even. I wonder at times if my brother even remembers that event. I don't know. I haven't talked to him about it, but it's stuck there in my thinking. And but it doesn't. There's an empathy, a compassion that God promotes in the lives of His followers that comports well with that story. And like I said, I think competition is a stage that displays our character.
Mm.
We can become infinitely wealthy, just like Solomon did in his time, and it's meaningless. None of it means anything. What competition has done for me is it has shifted my point of focus away from traditional ideas about winning, right? So we talk about competition as winning. Okay, well, what is winning? Is winning having more points on the board than the person you're competing against? Okay, that's fair comp. I mean, you can make that argument. Most people would.
Sure.
It seems simple and understandable, tangible. That's not what winning is ultimately. Jesus tells a parable in Luke chapter 12 where he says, this guy had a barn and then he had success, right?
Yeah.
And he couldn't fit all of his success in his barn, so
I'll build bigger barns.
Tear this barn down and build a bigger one. He does that and he sits back and he takes his leave, right? He retires or whatever that was like. Anyway, that the story comports well with people, even back in Jerusalem, Judea, at the time when he was telling the story to the audience he was talking to. Right. But Jesus turns around and he says, but that man doesn't understand that his very soul is required of him. And then whose will these things become?
Mm.
Who gets this stuff?
Yeah.
And
ungrateful kids.
Right.
That's I don't know. I'm kidding.
I don't know. Maybe children who didn't have to work as hard as the man did.
Sure.
Of course, that's what Solomon said. I got to give this stuff up to somebody.
Yeah.
Maybe that person's a fool, right? And in fact, in Ecclesiastes, he calls it a wickedness. That sort of thing. Anyway, but Jesus turns the story around and he says, so is the man who is not rich toward God. I think for the believer, I think for any theist, any person who believes that there is a God, if there is in fact a God, and there is, one should be curious as to what is of value to that God. What does he value? I've sat and listened to the skeptics say, I could never worship a God like yours. And I say, well, why is that? Well, because he commands worship. Like he's got this frail ego that needs to be bolstered by our worshiping and adoring and reverencing him, right? And he's always commanding. He's always showing us how to do that. Well, I can see where you have that perspective. I can see where you would look at that way. And of course, in the aisles of competition, we see that. We see people who are our material betters or our athletic betters. Maybe not so overtly, but at least surreptitiously demanding our respect. Right? Demanding our, and they do that, I think, as we would rightly discern, because they have egos that need to be buttressed with that sort of praise.
Yeah.
But that's not why God does that. In his word, he tells us that what he's very busy about is fulfilling his will. It's his will that none would perish, but that all would be redeemed, all would come to repentance. And this becomes competition. But it's not us who are competing. Father is competing for his creation. He's not willing that any of that creation would perish or be lost.
Yeah.
So if we understand that about God, then we understand that as much as we avail ourselves to his purpose of redeeming his creation, then we're becoming rich toward him.
So we might say then that by him commanding our focus to him is what is going to save us and cause us to shine brightly to people around, thereby drawing all men unto him.
Absolutely. The idea of worship, therefore, takes a turn. It's not the same sort of worship or praise that we think of when we extol the virtues of another human being. We lift that up. That's not why he has us worship. Yeah. He knows this. But the thing that we do worship, we become like.
And we're self-destructive.
We can very much be that.
So if we're not focused on him, then we're going to elevate something else, right?
Right. And it's not just us that are ruined in that process. It's the example that we become to other people. To people who have less discernment about God.
Well, John, I appreciate this time. I don't want to cut it short. We could go on for days, I think. We have, actually. But we're losing our semi-quiet spot here, so this is going to be very hard to edit. Background noise. So thank you for taking the time, and very insightful.
Compete for men's souls. That's what God has us here to do. And when we worship him, know that he has us to worship him because he knows that the more that we worship him, the more we become just like he is. That Jesus will be the firstborn among many brethren.
Amen.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Appreciate the time with you this afternoon.
Thank you.